The sun hung low over the Montana Territory, painting the dusty town of Redemption Creek in shades of amber and gold. Sarah Mitchell stood behind the counter of her father's general store, her hands busy folding bolts of calico fabric, while her mind wandered to places she had learned long ago not to visit. At 26 years old, she had watched every girl her age marry and start families, had attended their weddings with a smile plastered on her round face, had sewn baby clothes for their children with fingers that trembled only when she was alone. The mirror in her small room above the store told her what the town had been whispering since she was 15. She was too heavy, too plain, too much of everything except the delicate, willowy beauty that frontier men seemed to prize above all else. Her father, Benjamin Mitchell, had stopped trying to arrange introductions years ago. The disappointment in his eyes had been harder to bear than the rejections themselves. He was a good man, gruff but loving, and Sarah knew he worried about what would become of her when he was gone. The store provided a living, but the frontier was no place for a woman alone. Without a husband, without children, she would simply fade into the background of Redemption Creek like the faded photographs in the window of the photography studio, forgotten and gathering dust. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. She looked up to see Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, gliding in with her daughter Elizabeth. Martha's eyes swept over Sarah with the practiced dismissiveness of a woman who had long ago categorized her as irrelevant. Elizabeth, barely 18 and beautiful in the way that made men stumble over their own feet, smiled with the kind of pity that cut deeper than outright cruelty. They made their purchases with minimal conversation, and Sarah wrapped their items in brown paper with efficiency born of years of practice. As they left, she heard Martha's voice drift back through the open door, not quite soft enough to be private. Such a shame about Benjamin's daughter. He's a good man, but that girl will be a burden on him until he dies. No man wants a wife who looks like she ate her way through the winter stores. The words weren't new, but they still landed like stones in Sarah's chest. She had heard variations of them her entire adult life. She had learned to armor herself against them, to pretend they bounced off without leaving marks. But alone in the quiet store, she allowed herself a moment of anguish. Her hands shook as she tidied the counter, and she blinked rapidly against the burning in her eyes. Crying changed nothing. She had learned that too. The afternoon wore on, and the store remained quiet. Sarah was inventorying the dry goods when the bell chimed again. She turned, expecting another neighbor with polite disdain in their eyes, but instead found herself looking at a stranger. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard labor, and a face weathered by sun and wind. His hat was dusty from the trail, and his clothes marked him as a working cowboy, not one of the gentlemen ranchers who sometimes passed through town. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a startling blue, clear and direct, and when they met hers, they didn't slide away or fill with the familiar dismissal. He looked at her like she was simply a person, nothing more, nothing less. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting over cattle drives and campfires. "I'm looking for supplies. Beans, flour, coffee, salt pork if you have it. Enough for a month or so." Sarah found her voice, professional and steady. "Of course. Are you new to the area? Just bought the old Henderson place about 10 miles north. Needs work, but the land's good." He moved through the store with her, and she noticed he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. "Name's Thomas Garrett. Most folks call me Tom. Sarah Mitchell. My father owns the store." She began gathering his supplies, and he helped her carry the heavier items to the counter. His hands were scarred and calloused. The hands of a man who had worked hard for everything he had. There was something about him that made the air in the store feel different, lighter somehow, though Sarah couldn't quite name why. As she tallied his purchases, Tom leaned against the counter, studying her with an openness that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "You know the area well, Miss Mitchell. Born and raised here. 26 years. Then maybe you could tell me where I might find good men for hire. I need help getting the ranch operational before winter sets in." They talked for nearly an hour, and Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with strangers. Tom asked her opinions about everything from which local farmers might have horses to sell to what kind of chickens thrived best in Montana winters. He listened to her answers like they mattered, nodding and occasionally asking follow-up questions. When he finally gathered his supplies, he paused at the door. "I'll be back in a few days for more supplies. It was a pleasure talking with you, Miss Mitchell. You've been more help than you know." After he left, Sarah stood in the empty store, aware of a strange flutter in her chest that she immediately tried to suppress. One kind conversation didn't mean anything. He was just a customer, nothing more. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, she found herself thinking about those clear blue eyes, and the way he had listened to her like her words had value. Tom Garrett became a regular presence at the store over the following weeks. He came in every few days, always needing something, always stopping to talk. He asked about her father's health, about the store's history, about Sarah's own thoughts on everything from the weather to politics. She found herself looking forward to his visits, found herself taking extra care with her appearance on days she thought he might come by. It was foolish, she told herself. Dangerous even. But she couldn't quite stop herself. One afternoon in early September, Tom arrived at the store looking troubled. Sarah noticed immediately, had become attuned to his moods in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "What's wrong?" He leaned against the counter with a heavy sigh. "Got word my sister's coming out from St. Louis, bringing her 3 children. Her husband died last spring, and she's got nowhere else to go." "That's wonderful that she has you." "It is, but the house isn't ready. Not near ready for a woman and 3 young ones. I've been working myself to the bone, but there's only so much one man can do." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I understand if the answer is no." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I need a wife. Someone to help me get that house ready, to help with my sister and her children when they arrive. Someone who knows how to run a household, who's practical and capable." He straightened, squaring his shoulders like a man preparing for battle. "I know this isn't romantic. I know it's probably not what any woman dreams of. But I'm offering honestly, a partnership, respect, a home of your own, and in time maybe more than that." The store seemed to tilt around Sarah. She gripped the counter, aware that her face had gone hot. "Why are you asking me?" Tom's expression softened. "Because in these weeks of talking with you, I've come to admire you more than any woman I've ever met. You're smart, Sarah. You're kind. You work hard and you don't complain. You see things clearly and you give good counsel. Those are the things that matter in a partner. Those are the things that last. But She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice all the reasons why this had to be some kind of cruel joke. "You're what?" Tom took a step closer. "You're exactly what I need. Exactly what I want, if I'm being honest. I've watched you, Sarah. I've seen how you handle difficult customers with grace, how you help the children who come in with their pennies, how you care for your father. I've seen your patience and your strength. That's what makes a good wife, a good partner. Not some arbitrary idea of beauty that changes with the seasons." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes before she could stop them. "People will talk. Let them talk. I've never much cared what people thought, and I don't intend to start now." He reached across the counter and gently took her hand. His palm was warm, rough with calluses and solid. "Real. I'm not promising you poetry or grand gestures. I'm promising you honesty, respect, and a real partnership. I'm promising that I'll work beside you, that I'll value your opinions, that I'll never make you feel less than what you are, which is remarkable. That's what I can offer. If it's enough, if you're willing, I'd be honored to have you as my wife." Sarah looked at their joined hands, at this man who had somehow seen past everything the town had decided about her and found something worth valuing. Every instinct told her to protect herself, To refuse, to not dare to hope for something that seemed too impossible to be real. But there was something in his eyes, in the steady way he held her hand, that made her want to be brave just this once. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church at the edge of town. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she had made herself, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Tom had picked that morning. Her father gave her away with tears in his eyes, gripping her hand so tightly she thought he might not let go. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by a handful of townspeople who came more out of curiosity than goodwill. Sarah could feel their stares, could hear the whispers that she had somehow trapped the new rancher, that he must be desperate or defective in some way to choose her. But when Tom said his vows, his voice was steady and strong, and when he looked at her, there was no shame in his eyes, no regret. He slipped a simple gold band on her finger and kissed her gently, a brief press of lips that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. They left the church as husband and wife, and Sarah felt the weight of her old life falling away like a shed skin. The ranch was indeed in rough shape. The house had good bones but needed everything from new window panes to a complete reorganization of the kitchen. Tom hadn't exaggerated about the work that needed to be done. But Sarah had spent her entire life working, and she threw herself into the task of making the house a home with fierce determination. They worked side by side from dawn until well past dusk. Tom repaired the roof while Sarah scrubbed years of dirt from the floors. He fixed the stove while she organized the pantry and took inventory of what they would need for winter. They spoke little during those first days, both focused on the overwhelming list of tasks, but Sarah found a surprising comfort in his presence. He was steady, reliable, and true to his word about respect. He never mocked her efforts, never criticized her cooking or cleaning, never made her feel inadequate. At night, they slept in the same bed, but Tom kept a respectful distance. He had told her they would take things slowly, that he understood this was a practical arrangement first and foremost, and he was keeping that promise. Sarah lay awake those first nights, hyper-aware of his presence beside her, of the sound of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body. She had expected to feel awkward or uncomfortable, but instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, safe. 2 weeks after the wedding, Tom's sister arrived with her children. Margaret Garrett was a thin, worn-looking woman with shadows under her eyes and 3 children who clung to her skirts like burrs. The oldest was 8, a serious boy named Daniel. The twins, Emma and James, were 4, wide-eyed and shy. They had lost their father and their home, and they looked at the world with the wariness of those who had learned too young that safety was temporary. Sarah's heart went out to them immediately. She showed Margaret to the room she had prepared, helped the children settle their few belongings, and that evening prepared a meal of roast chicken and potatoes with carrots. As they sat around the table, the first real family meal in the house, Sarah watched the children eat with the desperate hunger of those who hadn't had enough for too long. "This is delicious," Margaret said quietly. "Thank you, Sarah." Tom wrote that he had married, but he didn't tell me he'd found someone so capable. "We're glad you're here," Sarah said, and she meant it. The house already felt fuller, more alive with the children's presence. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. Tom worked the ranch with the help of 2 hired men, while Sarah managed the house and helped Margaret care for the children. It was exhausting work, but Sarah thrived in a way she never had at the store. Here she had purpose. Here she was needed. The children began to warm to her, especially the twins, who followed her around the house and begged for stories before bed. One evening, after the children were asleep and Margaret had retired to her room, Sarah sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Tom emerged from the barn and climbed the steps to sit beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment before he spoke. "You're good with them." "The children, they're easy to love," Sarah said simply. Tom turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "You're not what I expected." "Sarah Mitchell Garrett." "What do you mean?" I thought we'd have a practical arrangement, a partnership based on mutual need. And we do have that." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But somewhere along the way, I started looking forward to seeing you at the end of each day. Started listening for your voice in the house. Started caring about whether you were happy, not just whether the work was getting done." Sarah's breath caught. "Tom, I'm not saying this to pressure you. I just wanted you to know. You've become important to me, Sarah. More important than I planned on." She looked at him, at this man who had taken a chance on her when no one else would, who had seen value where everyone else saw only deficit. The walls she had built around her heart, brick by careful brick over years of rejection, began to crack. "You've become important to me too." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They sat like that as the stars emerged, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and terrifying and wonderful all at once. The first snow came in late October, earlier than expected. Tom and his hired men worked frantically to get the last of the cattle down from the high pastures and to reinforce the barn against the coming winter. Sarah and Margaret spent their days preserving food, sewing warm clothes for the children, and preparing the house for the months of isolation ahead. One afternoon, Sarah was alone in the kitchen making bread when she heard a commotion outside. She rushed to the window to see Tom being helped off his horse by one of the hired men. Blood soaked his left sleeve, and his face was pale with pain. Sarah's heart lurched into her throat. She ran outside without thinking, without grabbing a coat, and reached Tom just as he stumbled. She caught him, bearing more of his weight than should have been possible, and helped him into the house. His blood stained her dress, but she didn't care. All she could think about was getting him inside, getting him safe. "Bull gored him," the hired man said, his face grim. "Tore his arm up pretty bad." They got Tom to the table, and Sarah began carefully cutting away his shirt. The wound was deep, a ragged tear in his upper arm that would need stitches. She had helped her father with injuries before, had steady hands and a strong stomach, and she called on every bit of that experience now. For 2 hours, she worked on Tom's arm, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with tiny, precise stitches, bandaging it carefully. He bore it without complaint, though she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. When she finally finished, she was shaking, and Tom reached up with his good hand to touch her face. "You're crying," he said softly. She hadn't realized. Tears were streaming down her face, hot and unstoppable. When I saw all that blood, I thought, "Hey, I'm all right, thanks to you." He pulled her closer, and she let herself sink into his embrace, careful not to jostle his injured arm. "I'm all right, Sarah." That night, she sat beside their bed while he slept fitfully, fever making him restless. She bathed his face with cool water, changed his bandages, and refused to leave his side. Margaret brought her food and coffee, but Sarah barely touched either. All her focus was on Tom, on willing him to be all right, on realizing with stark clarity that somewhere along the way, this practical arrangement had become something else entirely. She loved him. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it felt like coming home. By morning, the fever had broken. Tom woke to find Sarah still beside him, her head resting on the edge of the bed, where she had finally dozed off. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her hair. She woke immediately, searching his face. "How do you feel?" "Like I was on the wrong end of a bull," he said, then smiled. "But better, much better." He studied her face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the worry lines between her brows. "You stayed with me all night." "Of course I did." "Sarah, I need to tell you something." He struggled to sit up, and she helped him, propping pillows behind his back. "Last night, when I was lying there in pain, all I could think about was you. About how much I wanted to get back to you, to this house, to this life we're building. This stopped being just practical for me a long time ago." "For me too," she whispered. He cupped her face with his good hand. "I love you, Sarah. Not because you're capable or practical, or any of the other reasons I told myself when I asked you to marry me. I love you because of who you are, because of your kindness and your strength, and the way you love my sister's children like they were your own. Because of how you make me laugh and how you challenge me when you think I'm wrong. Because you're you, and that's everything I want." The tears came again, but this time they were different. These were tears of joy, of relief, of finally being seen and valued and loved for exactly who she was. "I love you too. So much it scares me." He kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time since their wedding. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise. And when they finally pulled apart, Sarah felt like a different person than the one who had stood behind the counter of her father's store, resigned to a life of loneliness and quiet desperation. Tom's arm healed slowly, and during his recovery, their relationship deepened. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. They laughed together, argued occasionally, and learned the rhythms of true partnership. Sarah discovered that Tom was not only steady and kind, but also funny and thoughtful in ways that surprised her daily. One evening in December, the house warm despite the howling wind outside. They gathered in the parlor after dinner. Margaret was mending clothes while the children played with wooden toys Tom had carved during his recovery. Sarah was reading aloud from a book of poetry, and Tom was stretched out on the floor near the fire, watching her with an expression that made her stumble over the words. "Read that part again," little Emma said. "The part about the stars." Sarah obliged, and as she read, she looked around at this makeshift family they had built. Margaret's face had lost its haggard look, and the children were thriving, growing rounder and healthier by the day. Tom caught her eye and smiled, and in that moment, Sarah felt a contentment so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Tom pulled Sarah close. They lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked quietly. "To town, I mean, to your father's store. Sometimes I miss my father. But go back to live there." She shook her head. "No, this is home now. This is where I belong. Do you remember what Martha Henderson said about you being a burden on your father?" Sarah stiffened, surprised he knew about that. "You heard? I was coming in right after them. I heard what she said." He tightened his arms around her. "She was wrong about you, Sarah. So wrong. You're not a burden to anyone. You're a blessing. You've made this house a home. You've helped my sister heal. You've given those children security and love. You've made me happier than I ever thought I'd be. If that's a burden, then I'll carry it gladly for the rest of my life." She turned to kiss him, pouring all her gratitude and love into it. They made love slowly, tenderly, a physical expression of the emotional bond that had grown between them. Afterwards, wrapped in each other's arms, Sarah felt the last of her old fears and insecurities finally release their hold on her heart. Spring came, bringing new life to the ranch. The cattle that had survived the winter were healthy, and Tom was able to purchase more. The hired men became permanent employees, building their own small cabins on the property. Margaret began teaching the children their letters and numbers, and talked about perhaps opening a small school for other ranch children in the area. One warm May morning, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Tom while they were working together in the garden, planting vegetables for the summer. He dropped his spade and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We're going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are." She touched her still, flat stomach, amazed and terrified and deliriously happy. That Sunday, they made the long ride into Redemption Creek for supplies and to visit Sarah's father. Benjamin Mitchell had aged in the months since Sarah's marriage, but his eyes still lit up when he saw her. They sat in the store's back room, drinking coffee while Tom handled the shopping. "You look happy," her father said, studying her face. "Really happy." "I am, Papa. Happier than I ever thought possible. That Tom, he's a good man. Better than I thought existed." He reached across to squeeze her hand. "I worried about you for so long, Sarah. Worried about what would happen to you when I was gone. But I don't worry anymore. You've found your place." "I have. And Papa." She smiled, placing a hand on her stomach. "You're going to be a grandfather." The old man's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into a fierce embrace. In that moment, Sarah felt the circle of her life complete itself. She had been the girl no one wanted, the woman resigned to loneliness, the daughter who caused her father worry. Now she was a wife, soon to be a mother, a woman who had found her place and her purpose. As they prepared to leave town, Sarah saw Martha Henderson across the street. The woman's eyes widened when she saw Sarah's obvious contentment, saw the way Tom's hand rested protectively on the small of her back, saw the gold band glinting on Sarah's finger. For just a moment their eyes met. Sarah smiled not with triumph or vindication, but with simple happiness, and then she climbed into the wagon beside her husband and headed home. The baby came in late November, a daughter with Tom's blue eyes and Sarah's determined chin. They named her Grace, because that's what her existence felt like. Grace they had done nothing to earn, but were grateful for nonetheless. Tom was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his daughter, showing her off to anyone who would look. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the house warm and bright with candles, they gathered in the parlor. Margaret and the children were there, along with Sarah's father, who had closed the store for the holiday. Grace slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, while Tom added another log to the fire. Sarah looked around at the faces of the people she loved, at the home they had built together, at the life that had bloomed from what seemed like such an unlikely beginning. She thought about that day in the store, when Tom had first walked in, about his proposal that had changed everything, about the journey they had taken together from strangers to partners to true companions. Tom caught her eye and smiled, that special smile that was only for her, and she smiled back. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions. But here, in this warm house full of love and laughter, Sarah had everything she had ever needed, but had never dared to hope for. She had found her home, not in a place, but in the hearts of the people around her, and in the steady, enduring love of a lonely cowboy who had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. The story of Sarah Mitchell, the girl no one wanted, had become the story of Sarah Garrett, the woman who had everything that mattered. And it was more than enough. It was everything.